Hello. In this video, I'm going to give you an overview about what our next topic is about. Our next topic is called solving quadratics. And before we begin, I want to remind you of something that we learned first semester. Think about the equation 2x plus 5 equals 11. What we learned first semester is how to solve this equation, which means we learned how to figure out what x equals. And what we would do is use our skills of balancing to get the x variable all by itself. So we would subtract 5 from each side so that would cancel, and we'd be left with 2x equals 6. Then we would divide by 2 so that we were just left with x equals 3. And that would be our answer for solving this equation. In our new topic, which again is called solving quadratics, we're going to learn how to solve equations that have an x squared in them. So, for example, x squared plus 7x plus 10 equals 0. This equation is called a quadratic because it has an x squared in it. Now, an important thing for you to know and understand is that because this equation is a quadratic, which again means it has an x squared in it, instead of only having x equaling one number, x will actually equal two different numbers. So, because of the x squared, we are always going to end up with two answers when we solve a quadratic equation. In this topic, we are going to learn how to solve a quadratic using three different methods. The first method, which is our level 2 skill, is that we will solve quadratics using factoring and the zero product property. We just learned how to factor in our last topic, and we are going to combine this skill with what is called the zero product property. Now, the zero product property, which is sometimes called ZPP, tells me that if I have two things being multiplied, let's say A times B, and they equal 0. Because I know that to equal 0, at least one of these numbers needs to also be 0, I know that A is either going to be 0 or B is going to be 0. And that is the property that we use to help us when finding out what x equals in a quadratic equation. The second method that we are going to learn about is to solve quadratics by taking the square root of each side. So, for instance, if I have x squared equals 49, I could simply solve this equation by taking the square root of each side. Then the square root and the x squared would cancel, and I would get the x all by itself. And then the square root of 49 could either be a positive 7 or it could be a negative 7. This method is a level 3 skill. The last method that we are going to learn about is to solve quadratics by using the quadratic formula. In physics, you have used formulas before, such as velocity equals distance divided by time. Then, in physics, you would figure out what some of these values are, so maybe you know what the distance is and what the time is, and you would plug those numbers in to figure out what velocity is. So very similar, we have our own formula, which is called the quadratic formula. Now, this formula is a little bit more complicated than v equals d divided by t, and here's what the quadratic formula looks like. It tells us that x is going to equal the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Our job is going to plug in the numbers into this formula. So we'll plug in the value of b, we'll plug in the value of a, and we'll plug in the value of c, and we'll calculate, and we'll be able to figure out what does x equal. This third method is also a level 3 skill. So, to recap, a quadratic is any equation that has an x squared in it. In this topic, you will always have 2 answers when you solve a quadratic. And lastly, we will learn 3 methods to solving quadratics: factoring and using ZPP, taking square roots, and using the quadratic formula.